Okay, so the title of this text is Black Sunday, and it's by Lauren Tarsis. It says, Surviving the Biggest Dust Storm in American History. If you see me zoom in here, it says, as you read, what were the causes and effect of Black Sunday? We know a cause is something that happens, and an effect is a result of that cause. It's not always fixed. Catherine Haddrup thought the world was ending. It was Sunday, April 14th, 1935. Catherine 9 was visiting her grandmother's house in Hodgman County, Kansas. Suddenly, Catherine's grandmother rushed inside the house. "Oh my!" she cried. "There's a terrible black cloud, and I have no idea what it is." For hundreds of miles around, people gazed up at the same shocking sight, a mountain of boiling blackness churning through the sky. Was a major thunderstorm closing in? Was a huge tornado about to strike? No, it was a dust storm, the biggest in U.S. history. 300,000 tons of dried up soil had been swept into the air, forming a swirling cloud of dust wider than the state of Indiana. That cloud was speeding over the land at 65 miles per hour, wreaking havoc wherever it went. And that word havoc means like destruction. And it was headed straight for Catherine and her grandmother. See how this is in red, what I'm highlighting right here? That's called a subtitle. That means that specific paragraph is going to be about nature and balance, because that's what the subtitle is in. Extreme weather events like tornadoes and hurricanes are natural disasters, events in nature that often cause great damage or loss of life. The huge dust storm on April 14th, 1935 was caused not by nature, but by another destructive force, humans. To understand what happened, we need to go back in time to when Kansas and the surrounding areas were mostly empty wilderness. The region, known as the Southern Plains, contains parts of Kansas, Colorado, Texas, New Mexico, and Oklahoma. Millions of acres of tall prairie grasses once covered this flat, treeless part of the country. Those prairie grasses seemed almost indestructible. Some types stretched 6 feet tall, with roots that reached 9 feet down. Sorry, guys. Into the earth. The hardiest grasses could survive the pounding. Think about that, hardiest could survive a pounding. When you hear pounding, think of something, hard. So it's something tough. Hooves of buffalo that stampeded across the plains. The roots could survive the fire started by lightning strikes, and the grasses could live through the area's brutal weather, frozen winters, roasting summers, and bone-dry times of drought. The Southern Plains was a harsh environment, but for the thousands of years nature had existed in balance. The people who lived in the area, members of the native nations, like the Comanche and the Kiowa, left the prairie grasses mostly untouched. Now here the section is ripping up the grass. By the late 1800s, much of the Southern Plains had been transformed. The U.S. government wanted to fill up the wilderness with towns and cities and farms. It forced Native Americans from their land and lured white settlers to the area with offers of free or very cheap land. Settlers arrived by the thousands. Catherine's grandfather was one of them. He came from Ireland around 1890, eager to start a new life as a farmer in this promising new land. Before settlers could plant crops, they had to remove the prairie grasses to make room. It turned out that the grasses weren't indestructible after all. Using axes, plows, and their bare hands, farmers ripped the grasses from the earth. Within 2 decades, that's 20 years, millions of acres of grassland had been turned into wheat farms. A hopeful time. Now, before I read that section, I want to show you this map. Here is the area of greatest damage, or the one that was damaged the most by the Dust Bowl. Here are the years that it occurred. These are all the states that it occurred in. Let me get back to this section now. A hopeful time. The farms flourished at first. The year between 1910 and 1930 were unusually wet on the plains. As a result, crops grew quickly. Now think about that. If they grew quickly, were there a lot of crops or just a little bit? Keep that in mind. Towns, stores, and churches sprouted up almost as swiftly as the wheat. It was during this hopeful time that Catherine was born in 1925. Catherine's father grew wheat and raised cattle on a farm about 17 miles from the town of Kinsley, Kansas. One of 7 children, Catherine dreaded girl chores like laundry and cooking. She loved riding horses and following her father out into the fields. She and her brothers and sisters went to a one-room schoolhouse 3 miles from their farm. Catherine's childhood was happy, but hard times loomed ahead. Now, before I even finish with this page or go on to this next section, I wanted to show you these up here, these captions. Now, we see these images, and we know that they're not illustrations because this is an informational text, but I want you to read this here, this sub-caption on Native Americans. I also want you to read this sub-caption here, where you see pictures of the farm called Torn from the Earth. I'll pause while you do that. And while you're doing that, I'm going to go get some water. All right, I'm going to go to the next section. Dreams turned to dust. The problem for plain farmers began in 1930, when the U.S. faced a crisis that would become known as the Great Depression. Banks ran out of money. Millions of people lost their jobs. Farmers on the plains were hit hard because the price of wheat plummeted. This meant farmers earned far less than the crops they grew. Suddenly, families like Catherine's were struggling to pay their bills, and money problems were just the beginning. The year 1932 brought a second and even more frightening crisis, a drought. The rain just stopped. All spring, the sky stayed blue. Then came the summer, and with it, intense heat. Crops withered. Without the protective layer of prairie grass, soil dried up and was blown away by the wind. On windy days, the air turned gritty with dust. The dust permeated everything. Catherine's mother would rinse the family's plates before each meal. She would use a cloth to keep the food covered right up until the moment that everyone was ready to take a bite. The dusty winds were nothing compared with the storms that came next. Huge clouds roiling with dust and dirt. And the reason I say that's roiling, see this OI that I'm highlighting here? Like in boil. These storms snuffed out the sun and dumped piles of dirt big enough to bury animals, destroy crops, and fill basements. People caught in a dust storm would choke as the dust rushed up their noses. The swirling grit would rake across their skin like claws. I guess this is not the time to be dramatic, huh? Okay, continuing. As time passed, the storms became more frequent. That means they happened more and more. People began to see that removing all of that prairie grass had been a big mistake, but they could not agree on what to do about it. Meanwhile, life got harder for those living on the plains. Catherine's family was lucky. Money was scarce, but they always had food to eat. This was not so for everyone. During this time, many people, they lost everything. As the land turned to dust, so did their dreams. By 1935, tens of thousands of people had abandoned their farms. Those who stayed hoped and prayed for better times. The black cloud. On the morning of April 14th, 1935, it seemed those better times might have come at last. For the first time in weeks, the sky wasn't swirling with dust. A sweet breeze blew through the air. Few could have imagined the horror that was about to strike. That morning, Catherine went to church with her family, then to her grandmother's house. She loved her days with her grandmother, who spoiled her with freshly baked bread, slathered with butter and homemade grape jelly. Catherine and her grandmother were enjoying the day until the black cloud appeared. Dun dun dun! A dust storm of a stunning power and size stretching 200 miles wide and 8,000 feet across the sky raced across the earth. The storm was far bigger than any that had come before. It turned the day black. Farmers staggered blindly through their fields. Cars crashed. Whether anyone died because of the storm is unknown. But hundreds went to the hospital with a condition called dust ammonia, caused by the dust they had inhaled. Even though it has a P here, that's a silent P. Last section, hardships and hope. More than 80 years later, at the age of 91, Catherine still recalls the terror of the day that became known as the Black Sunday. She remembers how huddled she was with her grandmother through the hours-long storm, how they prayed together. Outside, the dust was so thick, even car lights couldn't pierce its darkness. Lightning flashed, thunder sounded. Neighbors covered their window with damp sheets to try and keep out the dust, but the storm was too strong. I really did think the world was coming to an end, Catherine recalls. But of course it didn't. Catherine and her family made it through. There was even a bright side to Black Sunday. The storm did so much harm that it forced the fun country to face this fact. Humans had broken and destroyed the prairie, and now it was up to humans to fix it. In the coming years, millions of trees and prairie grasses were planted all across the plains. Farmers learned how to farm in a way that was kinder to the land. The weather changed, and by the late 1930s, the drought was over. There has never been another dust storm as big as Black Sunday. After the storm, many people left the plains, but Catherine and her family stayed. Catherine later married, had 5 children, and settled not far from her childhood home. The dusty days of her childhood had so many hardships, but days like Black Sunday taught her lessons that have stayed with her. I learned that even when things didn't work out quite right, Catherine says, I should be thankful for everything. Now I'm going to stop, go back in here. I want us to take a minute to analyze